Now let's move on and talk about punctuation. Punctuation gives you the power to separate your phrases and your clauses. Yeah, it can add some style, but it also changes the meaning of the sentence based on the punctuation that you give. And this is often something that people, maybe they don't struggle with it, but it's usually the most common thing that you'll need to revise, is to make sure that you're using the correct forms of punctuation. If you look at this list at the bottom, you'll see the ability to separate with the punctuation shown increasing from a comma, which is a very brief pause, to a period, a very definitive pause, let's say. Call it a long pause. These can help people who are trying to read it out loud, but it's a way to organize it. And this is the syntactical sorts of things that you'll need to do in order to polish your papers very well. So you have the comma, a very brief pause. The colon is basically the same length of a pause as a comma, but used in a separate way to denote something in particular. The dash and the parentheses are almost the same, almost interchangeable. So I'll talk about how they are able to make pauses and in what instances that you use them. The semicolon and the period, similar. Let's just get right into it. The comma. Here is where you make the most commonly mistakes. You see what I did there? A little punctuation humor for you. It's very flexible and it's very tolerant, and you can use it all over the place. You can basically, if nothing else, use a comma. Like if you're not quite sure, add a comma. It's probably going to be okay. But there are 13 basic uses of the comma, and that will pretty much cover every need that you'll ever have when it comes to any sorts of punctuation comma usage. First usage of the comma is before any coordinating conjunction that links two independent clauses. Conjunction, a word that combines things, usually two ideas, and being the most common, but, or, there's more. What's an independent clause? That's an idea that stands on its own, and it's a grammatical unit that completes the subject-verb requirements so that it can stand on its own as its own idea, and it often ends in a period. But you can combine them. With this example, I completed the experiment and I got a good result. Those are two independent clauses. I completed the experiment and I got a good result. Now you may be looking at this thinking like, I don't know if I'd put a comma there. And you might not, but you would have to change it. And I could change it by making one of them no longer an independent clause. And that would be by doing the most common way, just take out the subject of the second one. So it could look comma-free like, I completed the experiment and got a good result. Both work. Both are correct. The second usage is after a dependent clause that starts a sentence. Example, when we started this experiment, we thought, in this case it's dependent. It's a dependent clause. It is not a full idea. When we started this experiment, requires something of an ending. I mean, you can even hear it. And in this case, it modifies the following clause. So we put a comma before those. We use commas to offset appositives from the rest of the sentence. Those are basically like side sentences. For example, two depressed patients, for reasons they did not elaborate on, quit the experiment early. Did you hear something in there? Did it sound a little weird? You might be able to actually improve that sentence even more. I'm hoping that I can develop your ear, your listening, and potentially you looking at this and reading, so that you can detect these cases where improvement and revision could come into play. Two depressed patients and quit, using the offset of positive here, seems like it's creating a lot of space from that subject predicate, right? Maybe there are ways to fix that. There could be improvements on this sentence. But in any case, that's how you would use the commas. This is still a correct sentence. Doesn't mean it couldn't be said better and clearer. All right, number 4. You can use it to separate items in a series. Things like, I invited publishers, editors, and principal investigators. What about that last comma? That's something that is called the Oxford comma, sometimes called the Harvard comma. And it's somewhat of a controversial character in grammar and punctuation. Do you use it or do you not? This isn't like an American English, British English kind of thing either. It's really more of a stylistic choice. And I personally do use it, but I think that I'm in the minority. And most people would choose to not use it, thinking that it's not necessary because the and is like the, let's call it a surrogate for the punctuation. But I believe that it contains information. Consider this example here. With the Oxford comma, you have, we invited the strippers, JFK and Stalin. But without the Oxford comma, we invited the strippers, JFK and Stalin. So there actually are certain contexts in which it is very important to use your punctuation well enough to get your idea across clearly. Of course, JFK and Stalin, they can do whatever you want, but they do whatever your punctuation dictates. All right, hope you enjoyed that one. Comma usage number 5, after introductory adverbs. Things like, unsurprisingly, comma, use the comma. I see this a lot in papers that people use introductory adverbs, which is fine. It's totally appropriate. But the amount is just too much. In fact, it's to the point where I think that some people have learned that you need introductory adverbs before basically every sentence, and that's good style. I'm here to tell you it is not. You should be using those sparingly. Really, structure is what will dictate two different parts of a sentence, or the connection between them. These should emphasize, and they do emphasize, but if you use them too much, then it just becomes filler. So you can use them, but be more sparing with them if you find that you do this a lot. 6, when you are attributing quotes, you can put a comma, especially if it is embedded in a sentence. 7, to separate each element in an address, also in city-state combinations within a sentence. That's just writing out somebody's mailing address. 8, to separate the elements in a full date. Things like the weekday is separate from the month and day, and those are separated from the year. And you can also use it to separate a combination of those elements from the rest of the sentence so that they don't appear. And maybe you need to write in a date for some sort of historical reference. We use commas in English when we separate words that freestand at the beginning of a sentence. And you may commonly see this as yes or no, like, yes, I would like to participate, and no, I forgot the comma. That last one. Use a comma when directly addressing someone or something in a sentence. Andrew, comma, could you bring me that? Or something of the sort. 11, use a comma between two adjectives that modify the same noun. It was a dark and stormy night. It was a dark, comma, stormy night. Two adjectives, describing words, that modify the same noun. You use a comma to offset negation in a sentence, and you use numbers larger than 999, those require commas. So we don't use periods to separate our thousands, millions, and billions, and so on. We do use the period to separate our decimal places. So anything lower than 0, dot, and then the rest of the number. The exceptions for the comma with larger numbers are years, so 1999 for instance, that doesn't require any comma, and mailing numbers. So once you're putting in your mailing address, you don't say, oh, he lives at 2987, 2,987. No, we just write the whole thing out. Next, we'll talk about the colon, and use them after independent clauses, but never just sentence fragments. Generally, you can think of it as almost answering what you're about to say. For instance, the example, Andrew teaches in two distinct fields. That is itself something of an independent clause. It stands on its own. It's like, okay, good for Andrew teaching in those two distinct fields. But if I want to add what those are, then I use a colon. Academia and sports. If you want to test if a colon is appropriate, sometimes you can do this thing called the namely check. Namely, that is always setting up that you're going to say exactly what it is that you're going to say. Andrew teaches in two distinct fields, namely academia and sports. If you were to want to use namely, could be a comma, maybe even a semicolon rather. I'll stay tuned for that. But if I want to just state it definitive, and I think the colon is a very good way to state certain things very definitively, add it. So if you're going to set something up with an independent clause and answer it, you add that colon. It's most often seen introducing a list or explanations or quotations. That's where you're going to see this a lot, especially when it comes to lists. Here's my example. People are commonly allergic to the following: peanuts, shrimp, almonds, lactose, and gluten. You just start the whole list, especially if it's above 3 items, throw in a colon. So other examples, and there are many that you'll probably have known, but sometimes these are different depending on the language. So you can use it to emphasize or extend two clauses. That's quite similar, not to a winky face, but to a semicolon. But here's the example. We used our method for the same reasons other scientists use it. Colon, it's the right tool for the job. Once again, very similar to the last one, independent clause, but with a piece that you can add on in order to explain, give further information to the independent clause. We do it in time, so between the minutes and the hour. We do it in ratios, chapters and verses, and even titles. I even used a semicolon in my own paper that was aspects of self, body, emotion, social being. I didn't put and social being because I thought it sounded a little more impactful. Stylistic choices. And speaking of that, did you know that the amount of punctuation that you have in your title can correlate somewhat to the average number of citations that paper could get? Huh, isn't that interesting? And I tell you, it seems like the colon is a pretty good bang for your buck, above average aggregate for getting your published work cited. So maybe you want to throw that in there. It doesn't look like the question mark's a very good idea. Even though questions are great to ask, save those for the introduction part of the paper. Moving on to semicolons. It's a pause. It provides a pause. And both bears and semicolons have pause. Comma, as I said before on my list, is a brief, semicolon, a moderate, and a period, complete stop. The bear says, I'm pretty sure bologna is made out of cow elbows, comma, but I heart it anyway. That's right, the guy didn't get eaten, it was the lunchbox. Using a semicolon has basically 3 functions that you're going to run into. It's to combine two closely related complete sentences, those independent clauses, which are not joined by a conjunction. So if you skip the and, you skip the but, a semicolon is actually what you're going to use to combine those ideas. Often sounds a little bit more direct, impactful. A lot of the times that just sounds better, especially if you want it to read a little better. I like to cut out the conjunction at a semicolon at times. You can use it to separate complete sentences, independent clauses, that are joined by conjunctive adverbs. And you can separate items in a list when commas alone would be confusing. Let me go into those just a little bit. So if you want to combine two closely related complete sentences which are not joined by a conjunction, especially when they relate strongly with one another. Here's an idea. I cannot buy a new car. I don't have any money. Two complete ideas, A period would also be grammatically correct, but to show that those two are combined, we say use of semicolon combines those two ideas very nicely. For instance, you could say, I cannot buy a new car because I don't have any money, and then you could almost use just a comma. But to just say it without it, boom, it's a little bit more direct. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Two independent, drawn together. Charles Dickens, very famous example of throwing in a semicolon to add style. The second one is to separate complete sentences that are joined by a conjunctive adverb. Those are the however, still, therefore, nevertheless, and you know many more. The monkey likes grape juice. However, she does not like apple juice. So some of those, they're not necessarily conjunction in the classic sense, but conjunctive adverbs. They can be used with a semicolon. And here you might even think of things like namely. In this case, if you didn't want to use a colon, you wanted to use a semicolon to do the namely check, you might be able to add a colon, cut out the namely, and she does not like apple juice with just a colon. See what I mean? So often, punctuation is a choice that reflects a style which will reflect our intention. And our intention should be to deliver a message clearly to an audience. And so you got to make a choice. How do you think that you're going to deliver that message as clearly as you can? The last one is to separate items in a list when commas alone would be confusing. And that's usually slightly more complicated lists. For instance, the store will be closed on the following days. Oh, we're setting up a list, so colon, Thursday, comma, December 24th, semicolon, Friday, comma, December, and so on. So if I was going to do a bunch of commas, it would be on Thursday, on December 24th. It's like, wait, when's next Thursday? Is that on December 24th, or do you mean next Thursday and then also December 24th? It's just to prevent confusion. This can be done in a number of ways. All right, moving on to the dash. This is a somewhat informal interrupt, and it's used to add additional information that can add explanatory value, explanatory information. But I should say that it shouldn't just be used all the time, and some languages really like the dash. I believe German is one of those languages that really, they like to invoke a dash a lot, but it's not actually used so much in the English language, and it is one that is considered or recommended to be used very sparingly. Nevertheless, it can be used. One problem with using the dash is that you're often making one idea longer than it needs to be, and so if we want to keep these ideas short, it's going to violate that idea. But emphasis is often important, and sometimes it's worth it, and this is one of those ways where we can make some things just a little bit more entertaining. So let me go into the examples here. Emphasizing or adding information relevant but not altogether necessary to the text. So the sentence could read, her expertise in science exemplifies her eccentric personality. But let's say I wanted to add a little bit of explanatory information, maybe address what could be considered kind of this wide-ranging, somewhat eccentric personality. Well, her expertise in science, dash, from body illusions to string theory, exemplifies her eccentric personality. It's got a wide span. Those are kind of fun-sounding, interesting experiments. It just adds a little bit of information, maybe even just a little bit of fun to that particular sentence. Let's look at another one. Clarifying or adding to a nearby noun. A noun is a person, a place, or a thing, with something containing commas. All right. Andrew, dash, an expert in kung fu, jujitsu, and general ass kickery, had no time to defeat all the ninjas. So here I just added in a little bit of explanatory information. In this case, it had commas in it, so that's the better tool for this sort of additional information. Well, there you have it. Try to use them sparingly, but they can definitely add a little bit of fun. Parentheses. Parentheses are very similar to dashes in their, let's say, their pause value. It's kind of an informal break, and in this case, it is tend to be added to somewhat less important information, or an afterthought or a personal comment, and it generally doesn't really have an effect on the grammar. It's just kind of embedded in there, and you can bury or slip information in it, but the parentheses, and even more so than the dash, gives the reader permission to skip right over it. You use a dash if you want to signal to the reader, you should actually read this. You use the parentheses to denote, you can just skip right over that. Here's an example. And this is about a statistician who is commenting on people flipping coins and then being surprised about the outcome, even though they have knowledge about it. He writes, "Even though those who have knowledge about statistics know this and should not be surprised about this. My colleague tried this, flipped 3 heads, and was amused. He should not have been." I like this example because it embeds additional grammar and punctuation, but you can see that it doesn't actually have an effect on the outside grammar. He still creates an independent clause here, solid idea, and you can even use the exclamation point, the streak with the dot at the bottom, to add some emphasis within these parentheses, and it has no effect on the rest of the sentence. So that's a parentheses. Where else do we use parentheses? In science, we use them actually quite often. For the most part, you're going to see that your citations have parentheses around them. Now you can kind of see, you get permission to kind of skip over them with your eye, right? When you're trying to read, you don't read from left to right, up to down, including everything in the parentheses. It would sound pretty wacky. We also do this for abbreviations. Deoxyribonucleic, da-da-da. It's like, you can just write DNA, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. Also for translations within text. Vini, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Let's eat, Grandma. Or is it, let's eat, Grandma? Remember that punctuation can save lives. And if you already know some of these things, you're going to be able to utilize grammar in a way that's going to save you a lot of time in your revisions. Also, think about what message that you're trying to send in order to be as clear as possible. Clarity is key, and punctuation is one of the ways that you get there. The next idea we're going to talk about is parallelism. You may not even have ever really heard about this, but it's very simple, and it's just a good tool to use to help sharpen the clarity of many things, and that's to keep like phrases together. Here's a very simple example. Cats roam the basement, the kitchen is full of dogs, and mice are in the bathroom. Or what sounds better? Maybe this one. Cats roam the basement, dogs fill up the kitchen, and mice are in the bathroom. Those are the same meanings. It's the same information. But in one of them, it's always the animal precedes the room. That's the second one. Cats roam the basement, dogs fill up the kitchen, and mice are in the bathroom. That's parallelism. Keeping little phrases in there, all in the same way, all in the same order. Some people think, I got to switch it up. But that's not actually true. You should keep, especially within the same sentence, different phrasings all in the same way so that they are easy to read. So by saying cats roam the basement, the kitchen is full of dogs, I've done anti-parallelism. It's a little bit more difficult to, let's say, read aloud, but it's just easier to keep complicated ideas all in a line if the structure of them is also all in the same way. This can apply to many things. It's usually phrases joined with and, or, and but. Could be a list, could be even numbered lists. They should also have some kind of parallelism to them so that the information doesn't come at a struggle, so that it comes in a way that's basically packaged for the audience to really see and understand. If you want to be a good writer, you need to read a lot, concisely write well-structured papers, and stay motivated. Is that parallelism? Here's an example. In our study, we had 4 distinct goals. 1, analyzing patient data. 2, new patient recruitment. 3, maintaining patient contact. And 4, novel model development. How could we apply parallelism here? Well, we could try to get all of the same structure. In our study, we had 4 distinct goals. Analyzing patient data, recruiting new patients, maintaining patient contact, and developing novel models. Could be different ways to go about it too. In our study, we had 4 distinct goals. 1, patient data analysis. 2, new patient recruitment. 3, patient contact maintenance. And 4, novel model development. So you can choose the stylistic choice, but use the same convention the whole way through. And that's parallelism. So we've gone through the whole idea of every structural element that we'll talk about here to be effective with how we write. And next we're going to move on to emphasis. Remember that in emphasis we talk about the main or independent clauses and things like end placement. So how do you establish what is the main idea, the main independent clause that you should be focused on? To emphasize these things can give a lot of weight to them. Their placement can cue us into their importance and also the newness of them. And so how can we make that work? Remembering the example of me as maybe a good father, but also someone who sets some fires on things now and again. Yikes. The example that we used before is, although Andrew is an arsonist, he's a good father. And here, I've established the main clause. He's a good father. And I have done that by using although. Although is discounting the first part of the information, although Andrew is an arsonist. And it's emphasizing what is to come. He is a good father. And that turns into the main clause. And its end placement also gives it the idea of recency. So it plays off recency, so that's the last thing you hear. If it sticks in your mind a little bit more, that's the point of emphasis. Only goes so far though. Main or independent clauses, that draws in the reader focus. That's what you're going to remember, if nothing else. And the end placement, as I said, it plays off recency. It's the most recent thing that you've heard, and therefore it sticks in there. And again, there's also the idea of the first thing to go in also sticks pretty well. So if this is just a 2-sentence deal, you're going to have some initial biases to remember the first bits, and then still the recency to get the last parts. Also allows for a cohesive structure, which means that things kind of stick together. It's always sort of like this old information and then new information. The older parts should be coming in the beginning. Though that's often when you're establishing. Because we know this, we can start to learn this. We started here and got here. It's going from old to new. It's directional too. It's just like the reading direction, left to right. Progress happens from left to right. Change happens from old to the new. It's very similar. Emphasis can also be drawn in through depth. Basically, devoting length and discussion symbolizes how important something is and can change how you think about something pretty easily. Consider the example. Although Andrew is an arsonist, he's a good father, a good husband, and a great teacher. All right, well, let's not think about that arsonist business. Look at all these other things, a triad of goodness. Emphasizing things in groups of 3 can also be very particularly important. For whatever reason, there's no science behind it. It's just groups of 3 are good. Well, let's try it a little bit otherwise. Andrew's a good father, but he's an arsonist, litters for fun, and likes to spit on strangers. So now we've made it a little bit less clear, but we didn't use the although, so the first part of the sentence is actually the main part of the sentence that draws people in. And that's good. You know, being a good father is a good thing, I would say. But, so now we're using the conjunction that negates. So but, and now I'm negating that I'm a good father, and I go into depth about being an arsonist, littering and spitting on people. This sounds negative. There's some there would definitely be ways to really drag me in the dirt if that's the direction you wanted to go. Something like, Andrew is a good father and a mentor to many. Unfortunately, he's an arsonist. He's been known to spit on people. Now here I'm purposely trying to be a little bit less clear. Now it's almost up to you, because Andrew's a good father and a mentor to many. Unfortunately, so now a little bit more of an adverb to already start to dissuade the idea of these good aspects. But I got here too good and too bad, so it's starting to become a little bit less clear, right? It seems like it's less clear. You could then allow the reader to decide how they're going to decode this message, but it would be definitely a more split distribution in this case, as it was in the other examples of using, although Andrew is an arsonist, he's a good father. That one will be set up to catch most people with the way that you intend it to be interpreted. This one's a little less clear. What about this? Even though Andrew spits on strangers, burns things, and gives mean looks on a regular basis, he's a great father and a pillar of the community. Also not super clear, huh? Because it's emphasizing, there's quite a decent amount of depth on the bad. And you may not be able to look past all those things. Let's hope he's not burning people. Then it's almost completely over. Good father, pillar of the community. That is some dissonance. Like, what kind of pillar of the community does these things, right? So the emphasis in this one is getting even more ambiguous, which is not what we want. So if we can match the main clause with the end placement, that's about as clear as we can be. We can also repeat things in order to clarify the emphasis. A message can be repeated many times in a scientific publication too. Often people think, I'm not going to do a lot of repetition in my science paper. But you're going to talk about your main result in your results, of course. It's going to be basically the first thing you talk about in the discussion, the implications of it as well. But your methods will be aligned, and your introduction will be really talking about a hypothesis, which will then mention something of the main result again. So your hypothesis will also be repeated many different times throughout the paper. Repetition is not a bad tool at all. I got to repeat many things just to make sure that I catch you at the right time, so that you can hear it and start to digest and take in that sort of information. Word choice, semantics, clearly they matter too. Stronger word choices will make things even clearer. So even if I have a sentence that says, Andrew is a great father, however he's a known terrorist, or however he's also a known terrorist, not gonna do me very well. As good of a father as I might be, the strength of something that is inherently negative, that semantical choice will definitely steer the readers exactly to where they will decode that message as highly negative.